What if Russia didn't invade Ukraine? For many, it's a simple question, but just like all things related to geopolitics, it's more complicated than it appears to be. And while it might come off as a rather cliché thing to say, we have seen that even in the current war itself, not even the people who are in charge of the said geopolitics are fully up to date on the intricacies that surround international relations and dynamics. Now, why am I saying this? I'm saying this because I'm just someone online who made this video just out of curiosity, not out of a political agenda. It's merely a thought experiment, and nothing in it should be taken seriously. So, on with the scenario. In October 2021, Russia began massing about 100,000 troops on the border with Ukraine. Following that, the American government went on to claim that Russia was preparing to invade Ukraine. Meanwhile, the Russian government denied the claims, describing them as alarmist lies designed to smear Russia. However, the Russian government reiterated its perceived danger of NATO expansion in Eastern Europe, stating that it will not tolerate any attempt to expand NATO into Ukraine. In the following months of escalation, the Russian side continued to deny any intention of invasion, despite the ever-growing presence on the border, while the war drums continued being beaten in Washington. As everyone was holding their breath, on 21st February 2022, while the threat of invasion seemed imminent, the Russian side unilaterally withdrew its forces from the border for reasons unknown. The threat of war seems to be avoided, at least for now. The overall plausibility of this scenario, or what exactly happened behind the scenes that convinced Putin to cancel the plans of invasion, I leave them up to you. What I want to analyze here is what would be the consequences of such a move, the decision to not invade Ukraine. This goes further than just Ukraine continue functioning as a fairly stable country, or the relations between Russia and the West not reaching the lowest point since the Cold War. And although the Russia-Ukraine war has received an enormous amount of attention in real life, most people still don't realize the magnitude of the effects really were. Let me show you what I mean with an example. Following the invasion and sanctions imposed on Russia, global oil and fertilizer prices skyrocketed. And despite literally being on the other side of the planet, the South American country of Peru was one of the worst hit countries, especially given that it was already in terrible shape before the war even began. This prompted the country's rural population to take to the streets in protest of Peruvian President Pedro Castillo, resulting in a massive political crisis that brought down the government in December 2022. 2 years later, the country still hasn't fully recovered from the crisis. I now hope you understand what I'm trying to hint at here. So let's go back to February 2022. The highly expected Russian invasion of Ukraine does not occur, and the Russians end up making the Western leaders look like paranoid doom merchants in return. Meanwhile, Vladimir Putin has no idea about the bullet that he just dodged by deciding not to invade Ukraine. Nevertheless, Russia-NATO relations continue to deteriorate, regardless of whether Russia invades Ukraine or not. The only difference here now is the fact that the decline in relations isn't as steep as it was in reality, for obvious reasons, and Kremlin will always regard any type of NATO expansion into Ukraine with resentment, and will do anything in its power to prevent that scenario from realization, but this time not through mass-scale military action. Russia will, and actually have in the past, try to influence Ukrainian domestic politics through hybrid warfare and political lobbying, and try to counter the Western influence in Ukraine through soft power initiatives and electoral meddling. While it is quite hard to imagine it now considering the ongoing war, back in pre-invasion Ukraine, the pro-Russian parties actually had a rather respectable power base within the country. For example, the second largest party in Ukraine following the 2019 parliamentary elections was the pro-Russian opposition platform, led by the former Vice Prime Minister Yuri Boyko, who lost his position following the Euromaidan revolution. Even more interestingly, according to a poll conducted in December 2021, just 3 months prior to the invasion, Yuri Boyko was only 20% behind the incumbent President Zelensky in a second-round scenario. And I'm using the word only here, because the very idea of a pro-Russian politician getting 40% in a Ukrainian election today seems a bit insane. But believe it or not, it was actually possible for a candidate at least somewhat sympathetic to Putin to get elected in Ukraine back then. It is also worth noting that while it was understandably overshadowed by what came afterwards, prior to the invasion Zelensky was in a terrible position. Despite getting elected with great hype from the people, and getting a whopping 73% of the votes in the second round in 2019, by the time Zelensky was entering his third year in office, most of that hype had faded away. Especially since his government failed to achieve any of his promised policies, the economy was not improving, the corruption was still not being handled properly, the country was still far away from joining the EU, and the government failed to find a resolution to the Donbass war. According to the data from the same poll I just mentioned, Zelensky had an approval rating of just 26% before the invasion. And the invasion actually redeemed Zelensky in the eyes of the Ukrainian people for his stance against the invasion, and this catapulted his approval ratings to over 90%. For Putin to not invade Ukraine would mean to deny Zelensky of that redemption. With no grand event to rally people behind the flag, the public support for Zelensky was guaranteed to collapse. And if Zelensky didn't have a trick up in his sleeve, he might not even be able to serve a full term, since right prior to the invasion, 46% of Ukrainians wanted early elections, and 65% believed that the country was in the wrong direction. In the end, the presidency of Zelensky might not be much different than the one before him, Petro Poroshenko, the man whom Zelensky beat with 73% of the votes. And I want you to guess who else's approval numbers benefited from the war. Albeit, admittedly, the situation wasn't as grim for Putin as it was for Zelensky, since the approval rating really doesn't matter as much in Russia as it matters in Ukraine, but it is still important nevertheless. Here I believe that it wouldn't be an exaggeration to imagine that Russia is still determined to take over Ukraine, simply through means other than the military, mostly through politics, as it tried to before the invasion but gave up early on. As the famed Prussian general Karl von Clausewitz once famously stated, "War is the continuation of politics by other means." I personally believe that politics itself can also become an extension of warfare, or a different way for war to manifest itself, especially in situations such as this. Russia does not invade Ukraine, but it doesn't mean it will simply capitulate to the idea of NATO expansion. Instead, the Russia will try to turn the Ukrainians living in Ukraine against Zelensky by sabotaging the activities of the Zelensky government. By causing internal socio-economic distress, the Russian agents in Ukraine will try to create a new tide of Eurosceptic populism with pro-Russian opposition as the leaders of the tide, very similar to the movement that put the former president Viktor Yanukovych in charge in the 2010 presidential election. However, it will be much harder this time around to get someone like Yanukovych get elected, considering Yanukovych's core supporter regions, Donbass and Crimea, have been outside of Ukrainian control since 2014. Meanwhile, throughout the places outside of Ukraine, especially in rest of Europe, the relations and trade with Russia continues to function as normal in 2022 as it did in 2021. And the economic wounds caused by the COVID pandemic will not be aggravated, and the economies could find some time to heal themselves. This would also mean that the regional economic grievances and the energy crises would not be as bad as they are today. In cases such as the ongoing economic downturn in Germany and the financial and monetary crisis in Turkey would not be worsened to the point they are today. While this is not to say that these countries wouldn't go free of any harm, the overall impact of the Russian invasion of Ukraine should not be understated. While in the sphere of politics, I'm sure everyone is familiar with the fact the war has left Russia with a negative image in most Western countries. And while there are some governments and political parties in Europe who still have positive or at least neutral relations with the Russian government, the invasion has forced many parties and politicians to alter their agenda significantly to distance themselves from the Russian government. Some of these changes have cost Putin numerous potential allies in Western countries, as numerous historically pro-Russian parties have come to power since the invasion. But Putin has already lost the opportunity to collaborate with these new governments. On top of that, without any invasion, Russia could continue playing its role as a significant force in European politics, and considering the rising wave of populism of our time, Russia could become a political force much more powerful in Europe than it's ever been since the fall of the Berlin Wall. After the border crisis in early 2022, one of the most noticeable changes to global politics would be the French presidential elections in April of that year, with incumbent French President Macron going against the right-wing politician Marine Le Pen, known for her pro-Russian statements, and was expected to become a major Russian ally in case of her victory. In real life, the invasion had forced Le Pen to denounce her previously pro-Russian positions and affirmed that she would continue supporting Ukraine in case of her election. Despite her pledges to mitigate the damage done to her reputation by the Russian invasion, Le Pen still struggled to shrug off the narrative that she is an ally of the Kremlin, and this notion would be used extensively by the Macron government, and successfully framed the election as a struggle between the forces of those who support democracy and those who support autocracy, backed by Putin, of course. Additionally, the fact that the election was held just 2 months after the invasion did not help Le Pen. With no invasion, Le Pen campaign would be undoubtedly in much better shape, now with securing the direct support of the Russian government throughout the campaign. And while this still would be an uphill battle for Le Pen, the idea of her getting elected as the President of France is a possibility is much more likely than you'd think. The election of Le Pen would become one of the greatest upsets in modern European political history since the fall of the Eastern Bloc in 1989, and the fact that a country with a permanent seat in the United Nations Security Council now has a pro-Russian president would send alarm waves across the world, and would also further bolden the right-wing populist movements across Europe, many of which are known for their pro-Russian positions. Another massive upset would come at the November 2022 Italian elections, which, as you might know, saw a massive victory for the right-wing Brothers of Italy party, and saw Giorgia Meloni become the Prime Minister of Italy as the head of the most right-wing Italian government since the Second World War. However, without the invasion of Ukraine, the victory of Meloni would turn into another colossal victory for Putin, and the recent victory of Le Pen would only strengthen the electoral position of Meloni. It also should be noted that besides Le Pen, Orban and Meloni, many Eurosceptic and populist politicians and parties who were historically anti-Russia wouldn't be as militant as they are today. Examples of this are the Law and Justice in Poland, which was in power until the December 2023 election, or the Sweden Democrats or the Finns Party, both of which were victorious in their own respective national elections in 2023. While it doesn't mean that these countries will be now automatically Russian allies just because they don't like the EU, Kremlin can still use these parties as an instrument against the political establishment of the EU and cripple the European bloc from within. But this doesn't necessarily mean that Russia will now steamroll the EU, just because the European countries don't hate Russia as much as they do today. In fact, while the invasion did damage the relations with European countries, it also eventually created a new wave of populism caused by the economic impact of the war, combined with a new wave of illegal migration, which also caused upheaval within European politics. An example of this would be the victory of the Party for Freedom in the Netherlands in December 2023, and the ongoing rise of AfD in Germany. So without the invasion, it is uncertain how long the populist fervor will last in Europe. Nevertheless, going back to an alternate September 2022, and assuming that both Le Pen and Meloni come off as victorious in their respective elections, Russia still comes off as much more powerful than it was at the start of the year. Besides their new internal policies, both France and Italy will continue regarding Russia as a valuable partner, whose common interest goes further beyond just common profit in trade, but also on a political level. This is trouble for the United States more than anybody else, since the policies of the incumbent Biden administration might even end up pushing these two countries into greater collaboration with Russia. While it is not to say that these countries will straight up abandon NATO and ally themselves with Russia, it is to say that these countries might turn into something similar to how Hungary under Prime Minister Viktor Orban turned out to be and can be described as uncommitted NATO members who don't see any real reason to abandon the alliance. On the other side of things, the energy trade with Russia and the European countries doesn't break, and the European energy crisis doesn't occur for the most part. Additionally, the drive towards greater military spending within Europe does not occur since Russia is not regarded as a threat by the general populace. This also would mean that neither Sweden nor Finland would try to join NATO anytime soon, which is always good news for Russia. By the end of 2022, instead of the massive deterioration of relations that occurred in our timeline, Russia proceeds with a diplomatic offensive against European countries and try to outmaneuver the United States in Europe and establish its own connections with European countries free of American influence, particularly with the Eurosceptic governments that also might dislike the Biden administration. While Russia is never going to kick the United States out of Europe or anything like that, it still can lower the commitment European nations have in their relations with the Americans, and for the sake of the scenario, let us assume that Putin succeeds in that to some extent and successfully collaborates with European countries, particularly with Le Pen. Under President Marine Le Pen, France will inevitably distance itself from NATO and the EU, regardless of Russian intervention. While I also don't think Le Pen would pull France out of either of these organizations anytime soon, it will certainly act much more independently on foreign and domestic issues, and might even contradict the interests of the organizations they are a part of. Le Pen might even go as far as to directly cooperate with Russia on multiple issues, sign bilateral agreements, and maybe even collaborate on security matters. One example of this would be the issue of Syria, since Le Pen for many years actively supported the government of Bashar al-Assad and promised to recognize his authority once elected. Now, the idea of the French government collaborating with foreign dictators or warlords is nothing extraordinary, but what is extraordinary is the idea that the French, which was a prominent member of the American-led coalition against ISIS since 2014, is now collaborating with the Russians in order to restore the Assad regime in Syria, which is something Americans will oppose under any conditions. This Russia-France partnership wouldn't be limited to Syria, of course, but spread to many regions across the world, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, where the French influence has been waning for the last couple of years, with the failure of French anti-terrorism operations in the regions and the subsequent overthrow of pro-French African governments by the military, who were usually anti-French. These new regimes proceeded to collaborate with the Russian Wagner PMC for their security and to combat terrorism, preferring them over the apparently inefficient French forces. However, with Le Pen now in power, imagining of a French-Russian cooperation in the region is not an exaggeration. One can even imagine the Wagner Group forces actively collaborating with the French forces to restore order in countries such as Mali, Burkina Faso, or the Central African Republic. And although the French sphere of influence in the region was going to decline either way, the Russian and French sides might come to a power-sharing resolution in the region. It can be said that, without the invasion, a Russia that is not occupied with the war in Ukraine can become a much more powerful force in the international arena if resources are to be utilized appropriately. It can even challenge the American hegemony in various regions, in ways similar to how Russia turned the tables in Syria and made American-aligned countries more dependent on cheap Russian energy at a time of rising oil prices. But I also would like to add that none of this is to argue that everything would be better for Russia if it did not invade Ukraine, though I must confess that I made it sound that way for most of the video. As I previously mentioned, the war in Ukraine ended up consolidating the Russian government by creating a rally behind the flag effect that lifted Putin's approval ratings to levels not seen since the Crimean annexation in 2014. The war came at a time of a declining approval rate, and while it was nothing threatening at the time being, there was the potential of a much greater wave of dissatisfaction within the Russian populace, something which the Western governments would be very glad to exploit in the future. Without a war, Putin must confront popular dissatisfaction, risking losing his grip on power in Russia. In real life, the Russian government launched a huge crackdown on all dissidents within the country in the aftermath of the invasion to consolidate its authority. Such a move without any pretext would not be tolerated in peacetime Russia. Throughout the alternate 2022 and 2023, the Russian government will likely restore confidence in the Russian economy through the way it knows the best, selling gas and oil. If we factor in the labor force that immigrated from Russia following the start of the war, as well as newfound economic partners in Europe, the Russian economy has a good chance of recovering from the stagnation that has plagued it since the imposition of sanctions following the annexation of Crimea. However, the geopolitical struggle will carry on both on the domestic front and in the international arena, as the Russian government will continue in its attempts to outmaneuver the Americans in Eastern Europe. Ukraine in particular might become a massive battleground for political struggle in the following years, as both the Americans and Russians will continue to lobby for power in Ukraine leading up to the Ukrainian presidential elections in 2024. The world is still moving toward a new Cold War, but it is one that relies more on hybrid warfare rather than direct confrontation. And the political standoff between the United States and Russia over Ukraine might end up becoming the forerunner of this new global crisis, and the election might become an exceptionally critical turning point. Now, obviously, it would be very hard to predict how exactly the world would look like by 31st March 2024, the designated date of the presidential election. But if it is to look similar to the world I have predicted prior, one where Russia has a much greater influence in the European political scene, then Russia might end up having an upper hand in Ukraine, considering Russia has Italy and France on its side on the Ukrainian issue would create a Ukrainian scenario much different than our own. So allow me to oversimplify the entire process here, and let us assume the election becoming a two-way race between the incumbent president Volodymyr Zelensky and pro-Russian candidate Yuri Boyko. Starting off, this would become the third election since 2014, and as I have mentioned before, winning would be particularly hard for Boyko. In the end, the results of the election will determine the shape the new Cold War will take. If Zelensky resists Russian pressure and is re-elected with American assistance, I do not expect any bright days for Ukraine, and the situation might actually end up resembling what happened in the real timeline. Russia will never accept the results, even if Putin officially congratulates Zelensky on his re-election. Russian-Ukrainian relations will never return to the pre-2014 level, and even if a special military operation does not occur in the near future, the Russian pressure on Ukraine will not cease. If the situation escalates into an all-out war, you don't need me to tell you what will happen to Ukraine. Nonetheless, it is impossible to predict whether Russia will do better in this scenario considering the new allies it made over the years. But I believe one thing is certain. Russia-American relations will deteriorate regardless of what happens, and the world will see itself in a new Cold War perhaps even more intense than it is today. Now let's look into the arguably more interesting scenario, where Boyko defiles the expectations and wins the elections with Russian support, opening a whole new page in Ukrainian politics, combined with societal division that was never been stronger since 2014, since understandably a significant portion of the Ukrainian public won't easily accept the idea of a pro-Russian politician becoming president for obvious reasons. This would be by far the greatest challenge to the new pro-Russian administration, the issue of balancing out the relations between Russia and Ukraine. This is particularly the case since this was the very issue that brought down the pro-Russian Yanukovych government in the 2014 Euromaidan revolution. And that happened despite the fact that Yanukovych almost never overtly followed a pro-Russian foreign policy and claimed he pursued a neutral policy until the very end. In fact, perhaps the only occurrence of former President Yanukovych openly picking the side of Russia was in late 2013 when he rejected the EU-Ukraine partnership deal in favor of increased trade with Russia, something which only happened because Putin put pressure on Yanukovych until he complied. So now imagining a new pro-Russian government coming to power would imply yet another intense standoff with the Ukrainian people, particularly with those in western Ukraine. And if Putin has learned anything at all from the Euromaidan, he will know not to push the new Ukrainian government into accept policies that are not popular with the common folk, and only will try to pursue policies that would boost the legitimacy of the new Ukrainian government, such as helping to settle a peace deal in Donbass after 10 years of conflict and help establish the separatist republics as autonomous zones within Ukraine. Now, I am not saying that such a move would save the new government. People in western Ukraine will hate the government regardless of what happens, but at least it will prolong the era of peace a bit longer before tensions boil, and the Ukrainian people start flooding to the Maidan Square for a third time since 2005, something which I predict will happen somewhere around late 2025 to early 2026. Despite everything new President Boyko could have ever done, Ukrainians will eventually get upset, let it be through the provocation of a foreign power, an economic crisis, governmental corruption, grievance over Crimea, which is also something Russia is never giving back, or just out of spite of living under a pro-Russian government, Ukrainians will protest, and there's little to no way of preventing that from happening. The only thing that truly matters here is what would be the nature of that upheaval, because if things get out of control as they did in 2014, and the protesters actually do end up overthrowing the government again, then we will see an outcome much more different than what happened in 2014. The government won't forfeit so easily this time around, and Putin absolutely won't accept a third Euromaidan revolution, and will do everything in his power to prevent another pro-Western takeover in the Ukraine. That's why we still might see a great internal conflict in Ukraine, a scenario where the pro-Russian government doesn't yield and fights back. And when I'm saying fighting back, I don't refer to snipers on rooftop situation here, but rather an all-out battle in the streets of Kiev, similar to the 1956 Budapest. Or the situation may or may not evolve into an all-out civil war that is not limited to the Donbass region this time. With President Boyko asking for Russia for military support to quell the rebellion, parts of the Ukrainian army defected to the side of the protesters, and the rebel forces took over local administrations across western Ukraine and declared a provisional pro-Western government in the city of Lviv. But in the east of the country, Particularly in the Donbas region, the situation is vastly different, with parts of the Ukrainian armed forces, alongside pro-Russian militias, fighting back against the rebel forces and reasserting control in regions with the support of the local population. Meanwhile, in Kiev, which has a large population of pro-Western Ukrainians, the administration finds it difficult to maintain control and is effectively under siege from protesters and anti-government groups within the city. This will be the moment when the Russian army conducts the equivalent of the special military operation in this timeline, which is not focused on ousting the Kiev government, but rather on preventing it from falling to the hands of rebel forces. Within weeks, the entire country collapses into a state of civil war. Statements and condemnations from countries all around the world are made as front lines are drawn across the country and the Russian forces pour into Ukraine to fight against the opposition forces and restore order in Ukraine under a reinforced government. Meanwhile, most NATO countries, mainly the United States, will unconditionally support the opposition in western Ukraine, while countries with strong ties with Russia will urge for mediation and a cessation of hostilities. There is no way to predict the outcome of this alternate future war, but I guarantee you that while it will be devastating for Ukraine as a country, much like the ongoing war, if not worse, the sentiments surrounding it will be different, as it will be viewed primarily as a civil war between two internal factions rather than a foreign invasion that violates many norms and the international law. But no matter what happens in it, the global consequences will be grim, as the standoff between the great powers escalates to a point of the new Cold War, as China and Russia edge closer to one another and join forces against the United States-led global order. However, this time, Russia will be in a much better shape to compete with the American influence thanks to its newfound partners in Europe, which is something Russia isn't in possession of today because of its invasion of Ukraine in 2022 that cancelled out those opportunities. To summarize this video, I believe Ukraine will be harmed by Russia's ambitions regardless of which path is taken, but Russia will always benefit from delaying this conflict as much as possible in order to establish new alliances and partnerships to counter the undesirable forces on a diplomatic level. This would undoubtedly be a better option than allowing overconfidence to get the better of you and have you resort to the military option, risking losing everything you could have earned through diplomatic means. Thank you for watching this video. Please leave a like or subscribe. Or don't. I honestly wouldn't blame you if you didn't. I have to admit, this video is low quality in everything, but this is also my first actual video, and I'll try to make more videos like this on similar topics. So if you're interested in geopolitics or history or both, maybe stick around, you might come across something that interests you. So that's all for now. Have a good one.